There you go.
Welcome back to our study of the Gospel of Mark. We're opening a new section today. We have seen Jesus as he has had the crowds following him, and as he has healed and driven out demons, and we've seen just the repetition of his power and his authority and his identity, kind of those themes sort of running through. And so today we begin in the middle of chapter 6. So let's start by reading chapter 6, verses 31 through 34, just this little section. We remember that this is right after the apostles have been sent out. And they healed, they taught, they were successful in that, but that was sandwiched in with the story of the beheading of John the Baptist, so that, we really get that foreshadowing of where Jesus is going and where the apostles are going in imitation of him. Okay, 31 through 34, if someone would get that, please. Yeah.
Right. Then, because so many people were coming and going that they did not even have a chance to eat, Jesus said to them, "Come with me by yourselves to a quiet place and get some rest." So they went away by themselves in a boat to a solitary place. But many who saw them leaving recognized them and ran on foot from all the towns and got there ahead of them. Then when Jesus landed and saw a large crowd, he had compassion on them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. So he began teaching them many things.
Okay, what do you all notice about this? We've got some of these same items that we've been talking about showing up here. What can you identify?
Looking for solitude, and there are people waiting.
Yeah, there's a repetition of a word. The NIV translation obscures it. In fact, some of the other translations do as well. It's hard to get it, but there's the same word for wilderness, like John was out in the wilderness. The idea of making straight the paths, like in the wilderness, that word is repeated here in this section, so that it's verse 31, come away to a wilderness place and get some rest. And then again, in 32, they went away by themselves in a boat to a wilderness place. So this idea of the wilderness is coming up, same as the voice calling in the wilderness, right? But yeah, the crowds, right? They chase him down again. We've seen so many mentions of the crowds, right? And how does Jesus feel about the crowds?
He has pity on them.
Okay, pity. What other translations do you have?
My ESV says compassion.
Compassion, yeah. Any others? You may have moved with compassion. This is that same word that like gut wrenched. It's that those ideas of like pity coming from the bowels, just like we say, like love comes from the heart. Well, your love doesn't come from your heart, but that's the sort of like bodily analogy that we commonly use, metaphor, and this is gut wrenched, this inward wrenching that we would translate as compassion. Why does he have compassion on them? What does he say they're like?
Sheep without a shepherd.
Yeah, this is another one of those really strong callbacks to our Hebrew scriptures, right? So in Numbers, I have a passage from Numbers 27, 15 through 20 that I'll read. Moses, this is the end of Moses's life. Moses is leaving the Israelites because he's done, right? This is the end of his life. And it says, Moses said to the Lord, "May the Lord, the God who gives breath to all living things, appoint someone over this community," right? He needs a leader to replace himself, to go out and come in before them, one who will lead them and bring them in, so that the Lord's people will not be like sheep without a shepherd. So the Lord said to Moses, "Take Joshua, son of Nun, a man in whom is the spirit of leadership, and lay your hand on him. Have him stand before Eleazar the priest and the entire assembly, and commission him in their presence. Give him some of your authority, so the whole Israelite community will obey him. So this is the first sort of like bringing in of Joshua as the new leader of the people to replace Moses. What do we know about the names Joshua and Jesus?
The same name.
Right, so Joshua is the Hebrew form and Jesus is the Greek form of the same name, right? It means salvation. And so we see like Jesus in this role. We've seen it before and we're going to see it again, this role of the new Moses, the inheritor of the leadership of the people of God, the one after Moses. And so Jesus is coming as the one who will be there. So the Lord's people will not be like sheep without a shepherd. That same phrase kind of pulls from that Hebrew verse into this New Testament verse. There's also prophecies about shepherding. Okay, turn over to Ezekiel 34. This is a long chapter. We are not going to read all of it because there's so much, but it's a great one to read all of, and it really is very provocative, and you know how much it brings up and how much sort of pointing to the Messiah it does. So I'm going to read you a few selected verses out of here. In verse 2, Son of Man, or I'll start at verse 1. The word of the Lord came to me, Son of Man. There we have our Son of Man phrase. Prophesy against the shepherds of Israel. Prophesy and say to them, this is what the sovereign Lord says. Woe to you, shepherds of Israel, who only take care of yourself. Should not shepherds take care of the flock? So this is a prophecy that's coming to Ezekiel in a time that the Israelites have disobeyed and are about to go into exile, right? Verse 4, you have not strengthened the weak or healed the sick or bound up the injured, right? What has Jesus been doing? You have not brought back the strays or searched for the lost. You have ruled them harshly and brutally. So they were scattered because there was no shepherd. And when they were scattered, they became food for all the wild animals. And my sheep wandered all over the mountains and on every high hill, and they were scattered over the whole earth, and no one searched or looked for them. So, you know, an indictment of the shepherds of Israel in this previous time, right? Skip down to verse 11. For this is what the sovereign Lord says, I myself will search for my sheep and look for them. As a shepherd looks after his scattered flock when he is with them, so will I look after my sheep. I will rescue them from all the places they were scattered on a day of clouds and darkness. I will bring them out from the nations and gather them from the countries, and I will bring them into their own land, and I will pasture them on the mountains of Israel, in the ravines and all the settlements of the land. Verse 15, I myself will tend my sheep and have them lie down, declares the sovereign Lord. I will search for the lost and bring back the strays. I will bind up the injured and strengthen the weak, but the sleek and strong I will destroy. I will shepherd the flock with justice. Okay, so we have this sort of prophetic statement of God shepherding the people himself. All right, skip down to verse 23. I will place over them one shepherd, my servant David, and he will tend them. He will tend them and be their shepherd. I, the Lord, will be their God, and my servant David will be prince among them. I, the Lord, have spoken. Verse 30. Then they will know that I, the Lord their God, am with them, and they, the Israelites, are my people, declares the sovereign Lord. You are my sheep, the sheep of my pasture, and I am your God, declares the sovereign Lord. Okay, so then we move into this David, or the heir of David will be their shepherd, right? So if you're in an Old Testament perspective, maybe you're thinking, which is it? So what happens when Jesus starts to pull out this shepherd imagery and starts to use it about himself?
It's twofold because it's both David and it's the analogy of God.
Yeah, we really get kind of this layering effect where they didn't know to expect that the heir of David would also be God himself. But we as the reader are knowing that. And so we're seeing this twofold meaning out of Jesus drawing in this idea of the shepherd of his people. So not only is he kind of putting himself, the crowds, right? He is the shepherd. Right, but then we see there was an indictment of the people of Israel in that time. What's the parallel here?
The parallel is he's actually doing the things that the shepherd would do as opposed to failing.
Right. So there's
Well, and he's talking to Gentiles, and the Pharisees and Sadducees would never talk to the Gentiles about it. I mean,
mostly sinners, but yes, yeah, we talked about the healing and of the legion of demons in Gennesaret, and so yes, there's both of those things. Like he speaks to the sinners, like he's talking about binding up the injured and bringing healing. So there's this idea that if he's doing it, it's because it is undone. It's because no one has done it right. He looks at the people, he has compassion on them because they're like sheep without a shepherd. They should have shepherds. So the accusation is there, right? If he says they're like sheep without a shepherd, then he's saying the leaders have not been doing their job, right? They're desperately hungry for what Jesus is offering. So what does he do? Verse 34.
Teach them many things.
Yeah, he starts teaching. So this is one of the things he's providing is the word of God, right? He's teaching. And they have been flocking to him for his teaching. But verse 35, it comes a time where they need more than that also. They still need the teaching. Let's read 35 through, I see I didn't put this in a separate little thing. Let's read 35 through 44.
I'll read.
Thanks.
And when it grew late, his disciples came to him and said, "This is a desolate place, and the hour is now late. Send away to go into the surrounding countryside and villages and buy themselves something to eat." But he answered them, "You give them something to eat." And they said to him, "Shall we go and buy 200 denarii worth of bread and give it to them to eat?" And he said to them, "How many loaves do you have? Go and see." And when they had found out, they said, 5 and 2 fish. Then he commanded them all to sit down in groups on the green grass. So they sat down in groups by hundreds and by 50s. And taking the 5 loaves and 2 fish, he looked up to heaven and said, blessing, and broke the loaves and gave them to the disciples to set before people. And he divided the 2 fish among them all, and they all ate and were satisfied. And they took up 12 baskets full of broken pieces of the fish, and those who ate the loaves were 5,000 men.
Okay, thank you. So they have been there, they have listening, they've been seeking out his teaching, but the disciples come to him and it seems like they have compassion on the people too. What do they say the people need?
They need food.
They need food, so do what? What's their proposal?
They're going to go buy, 500 denarii worth of bread?
Right. So I wonder if that's a little bit of a sarcastic suggestion. Like it would take 8 months' wages. What do you want us to spend $1,000 on bread?
That's probably Judas.
At verse, what do they tell them to do? In verse 36, what do they tell Jesus to do?
he says, send them out to buy their own dinner in the villages and stuff.
send them away to the surrounding countryside. Very sensible, right? But what does Jesus tell them?
You give them something to eat.
Right? That's a tall order. Think about these disciples. They're just like, they barely came back from doing some healing. And he's like, you take care of it. Like, we don't even know where to start. Where would we even start with that? We don't have the money. What do you want us to go somewhere and buy it? What do you want us to do? But we have the, again, with the echoes of the Old Testament, right? Who's being sort of called on here?
The next leadership.
Okay, so who was the leader that fed them in the wilderness?
God fed them in the wilderness.
Yeah, through whom? Who was their leader then?
Moses.
Moses, right? The manna and the quail, the bread and the meat, right? That's their feeding in the wilderness. And we even have this idea of having them sit down in these groups of hundreds and fifties, which was exactly what Moses's organizational system was in the wilderness. And so we get this idea that like God continues to provide. He continues to echo. He continues to show Jesus to be the new Moses, right? With one more Old Testament echo, there's this little passage in First Kings about Elisha, right? And we may remember a lot of the miracles of Elisha, because remember he called out a drought upon Israel during the time of Ahab, and he had that contest on Mount Carmel between the prophets of Baal and himself. We get a lot of miracles of Elisha, and there's so many, and they're so dramatic that this one kind of, I think, maybe sometimes slides by. First Kings 4, 41 through 4. It says 4. That's not, there's no way that's 4. I don't know what, I'm going to have to relook up that verse because that's not right. A man came from Baal Shalishah, bringing the man of God 20 loaves of barley bread baked from the first ripe grain, along with some heads of new grain. Give it to the people to eat, Elisha said. Notice how similar the language is. How can I set this before 100 men? His servant asked. But Elisha answered, give it to the people to eat, for this is what the Lord says, they will eat and have some left over. Then he set it before them, and they ate and had some left over according to the word of the Lord. Okay, if you know this story about Elisha, what are you thinking when you read Jesus with the 5,000?
It strikes me that the more you know about the Old Testament, the more Jesus makes sense as the Messiah.
Yeah.
This is a story that the people who are gathered here would know because it's in their Torah, it's in their tradition. They've heard about this. This was in their Bible stories as a kid. So being in this situation that is a reoccurrence of the same event with all of these similar components is an endorsement that this is the Messiah, that Elisha was a prophet. All of these prophets and all of this story points to this man.
Yeah. What a great way of putting that, definitely. And what are the components? Like, where do you see the similarities? Call them out, because there's several in here, right?
Well, first of all, there's God realizing that they're hungry.
Okay, yeah. He sees and he wants to feed, right? He wants to provide. One of the common names for the Lord in the Hebrew scriptures is Yahweh Yireh, or you hear it sometimes Jehovah Jireh, the God who provides. The Lord will provide. right? You are the God who provides. And so here we see Elijah being the representative of the God who provides, and Jesus is just in the same way, the God who provides. Yeah. What are the details that are the same?
Well, there's feeding many with little.
Yeah.
And then there's doubt. There's doubt on the part of those, right? There's the
Right.
how am I gonna do this? Like this,
Yeah.
it doesn't compute. That doesn't make sense.
Yeah, definitely.
But even though they doubted it, they obeyed.
Yes, yes.
Mm-hmm.
And they didn't have the lack of faith that like prevents it. Like they followed through, and it was enough so that they were all able to eat. Right. We have this. It's barley bread. Barley is the poor man's bread. Right. This is the rustic. This is not a refined bread. This is not the first choice of the rich. This is the poor bread, and yet he has it and he gives it. Right. And then what happens after they have all had their fill?
There's leftovers.
Leftovers. Yeah, there's more than enough, right? My cup flows over. There's this idea of there's enough for everyone, and then there's still more, that abundance of provision. And it's multiplied, isn't it? Right? He has 20 loaves that feed 100, and it's miraculous. But here Jesus has 5 loaves that feed 5,000, right? His abundance and his provision is just multiplied.
In First Kings, when they were talking about the different kinds of barley, is there significance to that?
Oh, from the first ripe grain along with some heads of new grain. I think yes, but I don't know that there's a parallel with this story necessarily, although maybe. So the first grain is what you offer for a grain offering, right? Like always the first fruits to God. So like when you bring in your harvest, the first of the harvest is what goes to God. And so this person who came from the city bringing the man of God, he's like taken the first fruits of his harvest and brought it to the man of God, right? It's a sense of offering, right? And here we have like, well, this little amount. We've got 5, maybe we have that sense of offering. They're like, well, here's what we have, and then the multiplication.
Well, and both of these things take place in outdoor spaces, not in the temple, not in the usual spaces in which we expect God to act.
Yeah, out in the wilderness. Mm-hmm. Where it sometimes seems that we're separate from God. And don't we see that? Like the times that we go through hardship are the times sometimes that we feel God's presence. I think we know it when we live through hard times. You're like, yeah, well, that's all I have now. And so that wilderness provision of God it's so close to our hearts. I figured out what I did wrong on the verse. It is 2 Kings 4, 41 through 44. So, if you were like, I've got to have that verse, it's 2 Kings. Okay. So Jesus completes this healing. They pick up, and then it says immediately he made his disciples get into the boat, right? We're back on our immediately track. So let's read 45 through 56.
Or I can read it through 50. Immediately, he made his disciples get into the boat and go ahead of him to the other side, to Bethsaida, while he dismissed the crowd. After he said goodbye to them, he went away to the mountain to pray. When evening came, the boat in the middle of the sea, and he was alone on the land. He saw them being battered as they rowed because the wind was against them. Around 3 in the morning, he came toward them, walking on the sea, and wanted to pass by them. When they saw him walking on the sea, they thought it was a ghost and cried out, for they all saw him and were terrified. Immediately he spoke with them and said, "Have courage, it is I, don't be afraid." Then he got in the boat with them, and the wind ceased. They were completely astounded because they had not understood about the loaves. Instead, their hearts were hardened. When they had crossed over, they came to the land of Gennesaret and reached the boat. As they got out of the boat, people immediately recognized him. They hurried through that vicinity and began to carry the sick on mats to wherever they heard he was. Wherever he would go into villages, towns, or the country, they laid the sick in the marketplace and begged him, for they might touch him, just the tassel of his robe. And everyone who touched it was made well.
Thank you. Okay, so we have this kind of, what is this walking on water story maybe remind us of? We kind of just had a story a little like this in the last section. Which one?
Wasn't that when Peter was like, Lord, let me walk on water if it's really you? And he said, come. And then he turned around because he started sinking because he lost his faith. He lost what he was looking for.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting that account is included in some other of the Gospels, but not in this one that we think comes from Peter's account. I wonder if Peter didn't want to really emphasize that he did, in fact, walk on water, at least temporarily. I don't know. It's one of those where, you get the same story, but you get additional details in another gospel. It says he meant to pass by them. And I think that, it's sort of thought that he meant to show himself to them, but not necessarily that he needed to join them. But they're so frightened, right? Just like this, we just had this story of the stilling of the storm, and they were so frightened. And so, he joins them. And what does Mark say about the disciples in 51 and 52?
They were shocked.
Yeah, it says they're completely amazed for what?
They'd not understood about the feeding of the 5,000.
Yeah, or another translation says they had not gained any insight from the loaves. No insight whatsoever. Insight score 0. They kind of get harsh.
Hardened.
What's that?
Mine says their hearts were hardened.
Yeah, their hearts were hardened.
Which it gives you a little bit of a wall, like it's not directly my fault that I didn't understand this. It just happened.
Or maybe it's worse, like, suddenly you're painted with the brush of Pharaoh, right? Just like Pharaoh's heart their hearts are hardened. Like, they're definitely, do the disciples get any slack here? Like they don't come off very brilliant in this story, right? He says they had not gained any insight from the loaves, but their heart was hardened. Okay. So then we pass on to these healings, right? That as soon as they land, once again, they land in Gennesaret. So this is, not Israel proper, but they anchor there, and soon people recognize him. And so they're just flocking to him, right? They're bringing people on mats, and wherever he went, they placed the sick in the marketplaces and begged them to let them touch even the edge of his cloak. So we have an echo of the woman with the bleeding, right? These same pieces are happening, and it is put right alongside with the fact that even though it's these same occurrences, the disciples don't get it, right? The repetition is somehow not sinking into them. So then we go on to this, like, what defiles a person section. Okay, this is chapter 7, and we're gonna fly through it a little bit for time. Notice the repetition of the idea of bread going all the way through this section, because we're coming back to it here, right? Let's start at the beginning. he breaks the bread, the 5 loaves and the 2 fish. He breaks the bread and he gives it out, and there's bread left over. We go back and see that we're going to talk about eating bread next. So the Pharisees come and they gather around Jesus, and they see them eating their food with hands that were unclean and unwashed. That is unwashed. It clarifies. So what's going on here with this is that the disciples were breaking Pharisaic tradition, not specifically Old Testament law. This was a way they would do all of these ritual. It's not hand washing, like it's not soap, right? It's not about germs. It's about a holiness, right? So they would do these ritual dipping of sometimes their whole bodies, all kinds of little ceremonial washings. And Jesus says, Isaiah was right, this is verse 6, when he prophesied about you hypocrites. These people honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. They worship me in vain. Their teachings are but rules taught by men. Right? So we have the disciples don't understand. And then the Pharisees are actors, right? Hypocrites didn't yet really have that connotation that it has for us, right? This was like a word for actors. They are actors. They're putting on a show. Here they are, that you have let go of the commands of God and holding the traditions of men. And so he talks about what Moses meant to do with the law. Remember how when Jesus was so upset about the man with the withered hand, he says, you don't even understand what the law is for, right? We have another one of these moments. If someone says, I'm going to do this category of thing with my giving, then they don't help their parents anymore. And he's saying, verse 13, thus you nullify the word of God by your tradition that you have handed down, and you do many things like that. So here's Jesus, the disciples don't understand, and the Pharisees are perverting what the law is supposed to be. And he teaches in a way that is opposed to all of that, right? It's not one or the other. He's not hitting just one point, but instead we see, listen to me, everyone understand this. Verse 15, nothing outside a man can make him unclean by going into him. Rather, it is what comes out of a man that makes him unclean. So this is, it's a completely different way of thinking about both his power, his power is the power that tells the true meaning of the word of God, the true meaning of the law, and about the law itself that they were misusing. And so he's taken both of those and sort of turned it into like, here is the true meaning of what the law is for you. Thoughts or comments?
I have a thought. Hold on.
Yes.
Sorry, it's like freaking out. Oh, that's why I'm not on mute. So in the Old Testament, it's talking about being clean and unclean. And one of the things is like, if you touch a dead body, then you're not clean. How is that? I guess that puts a wrench in what Jesus is saying here for me.
So the first thing to orient is that being unclean is not wrong, right? It's not sinful to do things that make you unclean, right? So that someone has to deal with the dead bodies, right? That's a job that has to be done in any society. It's okay to do those things. But that you would then go through a ritual purification before you present yourself into the house of God, into the presence of God, because it's a way to highlight a community's respect for God, a community's understanding of, yes, we do these things, but we put our worship in a like on a pedestal, right? We put our worship in a category of this is important and it's at the central part of our community, and we bring our best to the worship, right? So there's that, right? And so like a woman is unclean during the time of the month, a man is unclean during, all these other things, they're not bad things to do or be. You just then purify yourself to go into the presence of God. Okay, so there's that. So when he says, and you don't eat unclean things, right? Like that was something that they just didn't do. Like the laws for food laws were like, you never eat these animals. So they both use the word unclean, but it's a little different, right? Because it's not like I have some bacon and then I purify myself. It's like they just never, it's like pork was not on the menu ever. So he is sort of addressing this idea that they're using cleanliness to present themselves as holy without respecting God's holiness. And we really do get like a later commentary from our author here, don't we? In verse 19, it says, in saying this, Jesus declared all foods clean. Well, I wouldn't have come up with that interpretation from reading this passage by itself, would you? And yet this was something like when we studied Acts, we saw that became a significant issue for the early church. And so the author is writing this from, those are the readers, right? The early church are the readers of this. And so he's going back and thinking about how Jesus thought about holiness and how Jesus thought about approaching God, and giving us an interpretation that probably didn't occur to them in the moment and is occurring to the author as he looks back from the perspective of the church. Did I answer your question at all?
Yeah, you did. That helps.
It's a little bit of a strange passage. There are a few strange passages in here, and that's one of them. Other thoughts or questions? We go, Gretchen?
I also think this is part of how the Pharisees were using the Lord's name in vain, so to speak. They were using those standards and using those things that were intended to just be protocol and using them to elevate themselves, keep other people from participating. They were using rules to create barriers as opposed to just being, this is how we do things.
Yeah, I think, those protocols were meant to put God at the center, and they were using them to put themselves at the center, so there's an idea that everything that they were to do was to approach God with the most respect and reverence, and with a separation. We see when we read the scriptures that the Hebrew scriptures, that they struggled so much to keep themselves from the idol worship of the surrounding nations, right? It was almost impossible for them. We see in every era, we're like, and then so-and-so had a shrine, and you're like, what? I thought they weren't supposed to have idols. And then it's like, and they took their household idols and hid them. And you're like, why did they even have household, like it comes up over and over and over again. We see like that they never could maintain that separation, but these laws were supposed to put them into a way of thinking that they were separate from all that. It's Jesus says that, he goes on to say that the separation was for you, but it was to keep you from the things that really matter. What comes out of a man is what makes him unclean. From within men's hearts come evil thoughts, sexual immorality, theft, murder, adultery, greed, malice, deceit, lewdness, envy, slander, arrogance, and folly. So he talks about like the point is to enable you to live in a way that is good, to approach God with reverence and live in a way that is not toxic, is not corrosive. It doesn't have the damaging effects of sin.
I mean, we still do this. Everybody still does this today. I mean, we make our religion our God instead of God our religion.
We do. Yeah.
I mean, you can see that in every sect and every religion.
Yeah, and even in, you know, when we, even in ourselves, you know, we're like, oh, I didn't, you know, it's not like I meant it that way, but we slide into it, right? We have to continually reorient ourselves to, you know, the goodness of God and the harmfulness of sin. We're not following a book of rules. We're following a God who is a person who loves us and wants good for our lives and not the damage of evil. You know, it's hard. It's really hard. It's so much easier to put it in a book of rules. And I think that's why Jesus was so harsh with the Pharisees, because they were all like really pretty good people. I think they were trying really hard and that they actually wanted to follow God, but they kept trying to put it in a book of rules. And it was something that Jesus condemned so strongly. And so, you know, it's worth watching out for.
It's like where he says that, you know, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. This was meant to be for your benefit. This was meant to give you space and rest and a way to connect to God. And you've taken the truth of God and turned it into a control mechanism for other people.
Mm-hmm.
Or even a control mechanism for yourself, whereby, you know, we do this to ourselves too. We do try to control other people, definitely. But sometimes we do it ourselves. We're like, I'm going to follow all these rules.
Mm-hmm.
When really we want to follow the love of God.
I like it
You know,
too, where it says, he who has an ear, let him hear. And people didn't understand, even though they heard. He keeps saying over and over and over again, he who has an ear, let him hear.
that's right. Yeah. And you know, we see that's so all of these things that we're bringing out, these have been the themes, right? They're mad at him for healing on the Sabbath, and he says, you don't understand what the Sabbath is for. Like all of that stuff, like it's running straight through. And in this section, we seem to have this repetition of the theme of bread. We go next to the faith of the Syrophoenician woman. This was the region of Tyre and Sidon. This is exactly where Elijah hid out and helped the woman and her family when there was a drought in Israel and Ahab was looking everywhere for him, where he went to Baal's territory to defeat Baal. You know, like it was, remember they really think gods are territorial. So it should have been Baal's home turf, but instead he was there doing miracles with this woman, and Jesus sort of echoes this same story, right? This woman comes and her faith enables her to answer with great humility. We have again with the bread, right? She says, I'll just take the crumbs. And he says, you can have a healing. You know, he says, he commends her faith. For such a reply, you may go. The demon has left your daughter. And so this, Jesus continues to reach out here, another Gentile, right? And then he goes and he heals this deaf and mute man. This is an unusual word for a speech impaired person. It's not used very frequently, but the place it is used is in the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament that was used by the Jews at this time, from Isaiah 35, where it says, you know, it's this messianic prophecy that says, then will the eyes of the blind be opened and the ears of the deaf unstopped, and the lame will leap like deer and the mute tongue shout for joy. It's God is coming. It's a God is coming passage. Isaiah 35, 3-8, if y'all want to read that later. And so this idea, like Jesus continues to fulfill what is promised about God coming to his people and making things right, making the way for them. And then we end the section at the beginning of Mark 8 with what miracle?
More feeding.
Right? It's feeding part 2, right? Remember, Mark does this with his structure where he likes to begin and end with kind of the same thing. And we have this bracket in the section, bread, 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 bread. All of this section is bracketed. The feeding of the 4,000, the feeding of 5,000 at the beginning, and the feeding of the 4,000 at the end. So he does, it was not a one-time thing. It wasn't a check off the box that he's like, he has showed up, looked like Elijah, and now he's done. This is truly his nature. This is what he does. He continues to feed the people. They have 7 loaves this time, and afterwards they pick up 7 baskets of broken pieces left over. And so that's sort of, and then they talk about it, and the talk about it is what closes out this section. Chapter 8, verse 11. The Pharisees and came to and began to question Jesus, to test him, and asked him for a sign from heaven. Well, what are they doing, asking for a sign? Didn't he just give them sign after sign after sign, right? There's a real sense of like, we want you to perform on demand. We want signs on our schedule. We want signs by our terms, right? And he says, I tell you the truth, no sign will be given it to them. Then he left them, got back into the boat, and crossed back to the other side. The disciples had forgotten to bring bread, except for 1 loaf they had with them in the boat. Be careful, Jesus warned them. Watch out for the yeast of the Pharisees and that of Herod. So he's talking about, you know, the rule making, the lack of understanding of the nature of the law, the lust for power that Herod displayed. And they, what do the disciples think he's talking about in verse 16?
It's because we don't have any bread.
Right. Jesus is like, you guys are blowing my mind with how you're missing it, right? The disciples come off, it's funny. It's a really funny section. They come off very clueless here, don't they? They're like, it's because we didn't make bread. He's like, I can make bread. Didn't you see the loaves? And he quizzes them. He's like, do you remember the loaves? How many loaves did I have? How many baskets of leftovers? How many? Then the next time, how many loaves did I have? How many baskets of leftovers? They haven't forgotten the incident. They just don't understand what it means. And so we end this section with the disciples' blindness, right? Mark has done a lot of words to tell us about all of these bread feedings and to tell us 2 full feedings and then review them with numerical analysis afterwards, right? Because Jesus is the provider, but he's also he's the new Moses. He's the giver. He's reinterpreting the law. He's re-giving them the law in the way it's meant to be, right? And then we got this, and it ends on like, and the disciples didn't understand anything, right? And so that's how we'll go into our next section, which you'll find it interesting how that section begins and ends, I think. I sent out a revised schedule because of last week's cancellation. So we'll be doing Mark 8:22 through 38. We'll actually like focus in on a smaller section, which I am relieved and ready to do, because these long sections are hard to fit in. But we see, you know, all the way through here, Jesus is the shepherd and the provider. He has compassion on his sheep, and he provides them with the bread that they need, right? His identity is focused on, and then it's put side by side with the lack of understanding of the disciples. So that's our stopping point. Then we'll pick up with the blind man of Bethsaida as we start next week. Thanks, everyone. Questions or comments before we close?
I didn't get all that with the woman whose child was possessed and then the dogs, feeding the dogs. And
You know, I went through that one really fast. It is a fascinating story. So a common way for Jews to talk about Gentiles would be to call them dogs, and it's derogatory. It's meant to be. The kind of the idea behind it is they eat anything, you know, because they didn't have like little cute pet dogs. They had like scavenger dogs, right? And so dogs are going about eating anything that they can find to eat. And so the Jews, I think, you know, they would call Gentiles dogs out of that sort of like disgust at their eating practices. They would eat all these unclean things, right? So when this woman comes, I think that we should view this in kind of a, you know, Jesus engages with her. I don't think he's trying to insult her or hurt her, and she doesn't seem to take it that way either, right? But she says she's a Gentile, and she says, heal my daughter. We definitely see that, you know, Jesus's ministry is first to the Jew and then to the Gentile. We get that in Acts as well, like first to the Jew and then to the Gentile. It is not first to the Jew because the Gentile isn't as important. It's first to the Jew, and the Jew is the chosen person to witness to the Gentile, to be a light to the Gentile. And Jesus' ministry follows that pattern as well. So he says, first, let the children eat all they want. It's not right to take the children's bread and toss it to the dogs. Okay, so that's like his, what do you think? You're a little out of order. It's not time yet. Like, remember when he says to his, this isn't John, but he says to his mother, woman, why do you involve me? My time has not yet come, when she wants Jesus to fix the wine. Right? This is a mark of like, okay, we're not to that point yet. But her answer is, even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs, right? And she says, I want any part of God that I can have. And her humility and her faith really come through. And he commends that faith and heals her daughter. So I think there's a sense of engagement and timing that's going on there. Other thoughts about that? This passage bothers some people. It's not nice to call people dogs, so I get it. But I don't think Jesus was being cruel with her. I think this was the engagement that drew out, you know, her faithful and humble response. What do y'all think?
The term used is kind of almost a racial slur, but not like he's calling her the N-word or anything. I've always kind of seen this as, you know, Jesus is a human being who grew up in a culture, and his response is how someone in his culture would have responded to someone from that culture.
Do you feel like it's a little tongue-in-cheek?
I think part of it is there's a pun happening there. But I think her response gets him to step out of who he is as a kid who grew up in this neighborhood and stop and look at her in a way that he wasn't considering. And I think we've all had those moments where we say something that's a phrase that we have heard our whole lives, and then we say it to someone and we go, oh, that's a different, I need to reconsider what I'm thinking. And I do think he chose those words deliberately, but I think her humanity and her response changed his original plan for how to interact with this woman, which I've always found amazing. I find this story very fascinating because it's a time where Jesus's behavior is actually kind of, inappropriate. And yet he still responds with love and compassion.
Yeah. I think that's an interesting reading, and I think it's a good reading because it helps us think. I think Jesus was aware the whole time, but this is we have to speculate a little bit, don't we? We just don't have, it doesn't spell it all out for us, and it's okay to be like a little put off by the way this goes. As I have spent more time with this story, I have felt different about it at different times.
Yeah, but it's kind of an intersection of his divinity and his humanity of like, you see just a slightly different view of Jesus.
Amy, what were you going to say?
Jesus has been healing all these people and doing all these things, but he tells them, don't tell anybody. And if all of a sudden he's doing it for the Gentiles, it's going to go crazy.
He is overwhelmed. Yeah. And I think there's a sense of it's just not time yet, maybe. What were you going to say, Bethany?
Well, for me, it seems like, he's somebody who's always talking in parables. And what if the parable here is somehow tied, it's blunt and, it's racially tied, not in a way that he means for it to be a slur, but he's talking in a way that's a parable that she's familiar with and can pick up on and real, be able to reciprocate how she feels.
Sometimes it seems almost to me like it's just as simple as saying, it doesn't matter who you are. It doesn't matter where you are. It doesn't matter where you've been. It doesn't matter what you've done. Jesus is he's going to cross that bridge for you. All she had to say was, you know what, I'm lowly, but even the dogs eat the crumbs. And he's like, you're right, you get it all. And just having the courage to say, this is where I am.
Well, we see Jesus, like, this is in another whole, not right, it's not right here, but when he talks to the woman at the well, he says, go call your husband and come back. You have no husband. You're right to say you have no husband. Like Jesus, he calls it out, right? Whatever the elephant in the room is, he's never hiding from it. And we see scripture do that pretty consistently, right? Where it calls out these things that maybe we would like, leave unsaid a little bit. Paige, what are you thinking?
Interesting discussion. The whole thing went whew, for me. So
it's I think when you know that the Jews would normally call Gentiles dogs, and it was all about eating, what they'll eat.
mm-hmm.
And when you see that Jesus keeps offering bread, the bread of life keeps coming from Jesus. He keeps providing the bread that God provides, and there's a sense of like, ask and you shall be given, I think, here.
Mm-hmm.
And don't be afraid to ask.
Yeah. Even Abraham he got to argue and bargain with God, right? So I think God is, he's definitely willing for us to stand up and engage. Mm-hmm. Great discussion tonight. Thanks, everyone. I will see you all next week. I'm going to stop the recorder so that we can do our prayers.